Howdy, folks, and welcome to another day in the Milky Way. Boy, do we got a show for you tonight. Another Buffalo Bill story, continuing his adventure. We're going to pick up on Chapter 10, right where we left off. We're not going to mess around. We're going to get right to it. Now, remember, Buffalo Bill ran for the fort to get help for the other fort, leaving his friend behind, who ran back through the Indian tribe and got to the other fort and to fight off the Indians again. Needless to say, nobody would, well, the Indians were, but, Buffalo Bill wasn't killed, and neither was his friend, Texas Jack. So we're going to pick up right where we left off last time. And so let's pick up there, and we will see where Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill are going. You remember, Buffalo Bill's riding this wild white horse that he stole from the Indian chief, Ocart. So with that said, let's get going right into the show. And I'm going to share screen. There we go. There we go. Okay. The Border King, or Chapter 10, The Ride to the Rescue. The Border King did not spare the white horse he rode, for he was riding to save many lives. He had known the horse when he was the favorite animal of Colonel Nelson A. Miles, and he was well aware what he was capable of. The white horse had been captured by Ocart in the attack on the military camp, and Colonel Miles had told Cody to ride and get him back from the Indian master. I will give him to you, Cody. You get him back, he'll give him to you, Cody. So there you go. And now the Border King had a long-bodied, strong-limbed racer, as fleet as a deer and tireless as a hound. The colonel used to call you a runaway, I remember, and what Ocart christened you, I don't know, but I shall call you after your redskin master, and it shall be Chief, said the scout to his splendid horse. On, fellow, the noble white, hour after hour, mile after mile, keeping up a steady lope. When the darkness fell, Buffalo Bill halted by a stream, took the saddle and bridle off of Chief to give him a rest, and allowed him to crop the luxurious grass that was there like a velvet carpet. He ate cold supper in silence, lay down for a short rest, not for himself so much as for the horse, and after an hour was again in the saddle. He knew the trail to post resistance well, and kept up the steady gait he felt would get him there before daybreak. And it did so. The horse and the rider were their tire when the lights of the post came into sight. Halt! Who comes there? Rang out the sentinel's challenge. Scout Cody, with urgent dispatches, was the quick answer. He was admitted into the post. He quickly told the officer of the day why he had come, and in a minute later was in the presence of Colonel Royal and Commandant, who had quickly gotten out of bed to see him. In his terse way, the Border King explained the situation exactly and energetically. And the commandant at once ordered his adjacent to call out 2 troops of cavalry, mount 2 companies of infantry with a couple of light guns to start to the rescue, carrying extra supplies of ammunition in ambulances. Captain Alfred Taylor of the 5th Cavalry was placed in command and ordered to start within an hour. After telling the colonel how he and Jack had run the gauntlet of the Indians, the reply of the officer was, "Another proof, Cody, that you are indeed the king of the bordermen. Now seek rest after you have something to eat, for my scouts will guide the command to Fort Advance. I'll eat, Colonel, but not sleep, for I have not time, as I go back with Captain Taylor, was the reply. But you cannot stand it, Cody. Oh, yes, I can. And when the command pulled out from post resistance, Buffalo Bill was ahead as scout and guide, while also went along half a dozen men in buckskin from the command of Colonel Royal. It was dawn by the time the start was made, and the march was kept up briskly for a couple of hours before the halt was ordered for breakfast. Then it was a rapid trot up to noon hour, and a longer halt was made for dinner, while Buffalo Bill snatched a mouthful of food, rode on with a couple of scouts to see how matters stood ahead. He knew that a ride of 3 hours would bring them in sight of the Indians around the fort, and he was anxious to make the return in the quickest time possible, and was much pleased that he could say that he had cut through the redskin line, ridden 50 miles to the post, and returned with 300 soldiers within 30 hours. Another thing the Border King was anxious about was the advanced garrison, for he knew that, well aware that he would bring help, the Indians would be determined to capture the fort with all dispatch. They would expect help to come so soon he knew they would not, and hence they would be surprised, while Chief Oakart, not aware that only the day before a large body of reinforcements had arrived at the military post, he would not expect Colonel Royal could spare more than one troop of cavalry to aid advance. This many Oakart would prepare to fight and defeat. This was all in the mind of the Border King as he rode ahead with 2 scouts. Before riding several miles, they came to a cut in the range of high hills, and the Border King halted suddenly. "Hark! They're attacking the fort, men. Go back, Judd, with all speed and hurry Captain Taylor on." Away dashed Scout Judd, and Buffalo Bill and Scout Barney rode on at a rapid pace through the narrow cut in the range. Once on the other side of the hills, and the sound of the guns at the fort advance were distinctly heard, with the rattle of rifles also. A couple of miles further on, and Buffalo Bill again halted and listened alternatively. They have a hot time there, and Oakart is determined to take the fort. From the firing, I know that Major Baldwin is short of ammunition, so go back, Barney, and with all speed, and tell Captain Taylor to get there if he kills every horse in his command. A short delay may be too late. Away dashed Scout Barney, and the Border King once more rode toward the fort, his face white and stern. Captain Taylor came up with the Border King 3 miles from Fort Advance. His horses were foaming. Half a hundred troops only were with him, and a balance in the mounted infantry with the guns were stretched out for several miles back, but pushing on as best as the animals could endure. Oakart is not looking for help for the fort. Ours yet, Captain Taylor, and so is throwing his war forces desperately in the attack. From the firing, I know that Major Baldwin is sparing of his ammunition. May I have a few men, sir, and push on while the troops of your form as they come up? Yes, indeed, Cody, and you can at least show a helping hand. Go, and God bless, my brave fellow. Take the men. Those horses cannot stand the drive, answered the gallant captain. And you, sir, send the troops through, carrying into the valley and the infantry guns along the way. Scout Judd and Barney will guide you, sir, as you and me did not know the locality, nor did I. But go! Away started Buffalo Bill with 2 of the lieutenants and a couple of score of their troops, keeping close only on the horses' heels. In a short while, they were dashing along the river and burst in full sight of the fort. It was a surprise to the Sioux to behold them, and they had no idea help was so near. It was a joy indeed to the gallant defenders of the fort, for they were about out of ammunition, and Oakhart and his braves were pressing closer and closer. An hour, perhaps half as long, would have meant certain death. Grapple at the close quarters, Oakhart found himself defeated, but he was game to the last. Though caught between two fires, he did not allow his warriors to stampede and panic. He rallied them, formed them into a massive group and a few mounted braves on the flanks, and began encircling around the hill upon which stood the fort. They moved toward the heavy timber beyond. Lieutenant Dick Danforth, in command of the advance guard of relief, turned to Buffalo Bill and said, "What shall we do, Cody?" The Border King listened for a moment, and half the heavy falls of the troops coming up, and said, "Help is coming fast, sir, and it might be well charging them, for the cavalry from fort will come out as a support, and the Sioux need a lesson." "Good. Bugle some sound charge," cried the officer. In another minute, the troops, 100 in number, were thundering down the hill into the valley in hot pursuit of the retreating Indians, who on foot moved slowly. With stubborn courage, they retreated. However, the lead of the column suddenly turning toward the river a mile away. Escape that way they could, at least, with their lives, and Chief Oakhart had chosen well. But the troops crowded them hard. Captain Ed Keyes and 2 troops from the fort rushing out to join them in the pursuit and drawing sabers for close work, as their firearms were useless, all their ammunition having been shot out. "3 cheers for Buffalo Bill," shouted Captain Keyes, as the 2 commands neared each other and sought the rescued, and the rescuer gave them with a willing, "Cody, you have saved us," cried Keyes, and recognizing the officers commanding the rescue, for the troops were from his own gallant regiment, he called, "Danforth, Mercer, I greet you and your splendid presence. God bless you. Now use the steel in those red hides and his rank." Placing him in command of the new arrivals, he led the charge just as Captain Taylor's artillery, having reached the ridge, opened fire and sent shell after shell into the low flying columns of redskins. Across the valley, too, were seen cavalry, mounted infantry stretched out in lines, hastening to join in the running fight. "Our guns and rifles are dead, for we are out of ammunition," Danforth called out Captain Keyes, and he added, "But our blades are sharp. Now for it." It was a grand charge, and Captain Keyes struck the mass of humanity with the Border King by his side, and suddenly Texas Jack coming up at a jump nearer by. Suddenly, the Sioux had halted to deal their blow, and it was a severe one, for saddles were emptied. But it was a flying fight, give and take, and the troops pressed the old Indian general hard and forced him and his braves to seek safety by leaping from the 10-foot high banks into the river, some of them rallying under shelter and picking off the cavalrymen. "I know you, great white Chief Buffalo Bill," Oakhart, "never forget. You save your people, kill my young men. Me remember, Pahaska." The words fell from the lips of old Oakhart. And were distinctly heard by the troops. Captain Keyes calling out, "He's got it in for you, Bill." Raising his voice until he sounded like a trumpet, the Border King shouted back to the Sioux chief, "Pahaska!" knows the cart, and I will not forget. The Border King could have picked off the chief with his rifle even then, but he would not do so, and both he and the army officers would not allow the men to fire upon the Indians in the river. Chapter 11, A Startling Discovery. It was a victory for the palefaces, yet dearly won, for within the fort and among the rescuing force nearly a score of troops had fallen, and a number were wounded, more or less seriously, while slight wounds were many, yet none not counted. But the fort had been saved in time of its greatest need. Hundreds of Indian ponies had been captured, and the result was well worth the sacrifice that had to be. The Indian army, under its brave and able leader, the King of the Sioux, had been terribly defeated, for the loss in dead braves was heavy. The wounded were many, and they had been dismounted, had lost their supplies and many weapons, and had been taught a severe lesson they would not soon forget. Upon every tongue was heard the name of Buffalo Bill, the Border King. But for him, how different would have been the result. All knew and felt just what the great scout had done, and today his saving of Fort Advance by the daring deeds is remembered all along the border. Embarrassed by the praise bestowed upon him, the scout looked to the care of his horse, Chief, and then slipped away to hide and rest, and Texas Jack kept his hiding place a secret, that he might not be disturbed. When he slipped out of his retreat the next day, he was greeted with a cheer, and Major Baldwin sent for him. And a parade that evening complimented him before the entire command, while Texas Jack was not forgotten for the part he had played in the affair. What matters had quieted down a little at the fort. Some of the rescuers had returned, and all were going well. Buffalo Bill had a talk with Major Baldwin, the result being that the scouts started off alone to follow the trail of the Indians and see just what they were doing after their defeat and discover if they were plotting more mischief. Buffalo Bill had another motive on his lone scout. It was to hunt out the haunt of the band of overland road agents who, under the old foe of his Boyd Bennett, a deserter from the army, had been lately robbing the stagecoaches and made weekly runs along the line of military posts. The road agents had successfully held up several of the coaches and robbed the passengers of considerable money and valuables. And the army paymaster was at too soon to make the rounds by coach paying off the garrisons. It was important to locate Boyd Bennett, the overland bandit, and his gang, and send a force to attack them. It was upon his return from the trail of the Sioux that he meant to go on the track of the bandits, but this later fact was kept a secret. After a couple of days, trailing into Indian country, Buffalo Bill found that Oakheart, the chief of the Sioux, was not then plotting another move, having been taught a lesson that would last for a short while at least, so he decided to go at once to hunt out the retreat of Boyd Bennett. He reached the trapping ground of the road agents without adventure and turned it into the overland trail, hoping to be in time to meet the incoming coach to Fort Advance from post resistance. He was in time and came upon the coach, but he drew rein suddenly, for that he beheld was a shock to him. There was a coach, the horses standing patiently in the trail, and yet no driver was upon the box, nor did he see anyone near at his first glance. Spurring forward, he beheld a driver, Buck Sharkley, whom he knew well, but he was dead. Then he saw three others. They were an officer and two soldiers. They too were dead, and more, they had all four been scalped. This told the Border King that Indians had held up the coach. Then Buffalo Bill recalled that a short while before reaching the trail, he had shot a deer to have some venison steak for supper. It was his shot that had frightened the Indians off. Looking about him with experienced eyes, Buffalo Bill read the signs he saw. There were the tracks of a half a dozen unshod Indian ponies, so the force was small, doubtless some of Oakhart's young braves. The driver and the soldiers had been shot with arrows. The officer he also recognized. It was Captain Hinckley, the post paymaster, and he had come west more than a week ahead of time. He was expected to arrive at Fort Advance. That he had his treasure bags along with the money. To pay off the troops a large sum, Buffalo Bill well knew. Had the Indians got them? A rapid search revealed that the marauders had been frightened off before they could take treasure. There was one thing for the Border King to do, and that was to place the bodies in the coach, hide the treasure bags to come after later, for he dared not risk taking them along. Then tie Chief alongside of one of the leaders and drive the stage on to Fort Advance himself. He quickly carried out what he had decided upon, first scouting around to see if the Indians had surely gone and none were near, and then securely hiding the treasure bags. When all was ready to move, he mounted the box, seized the reins, and started off in his way that showed little was a splendid driver, or he was a splendid driver. He had not driven a couple of miles from the scene, then tragically, when a loud threatening came a voice from the other side of the trail where there were a number of large rocks. Live or die, it's your choice. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Chapter 12, The Bandits of the Overland Trail. Okay, so with that, will Buffalo Bill get shot by the bandits? I think not. Or maybe he will. Who knows? Well, we'll just have to see and wait and find out in the next episode of Buffalo Bill Wild West Stories. So you tune in next time. I feel like somebody off of the radio of yesteryear, don't I? But anyway, tune in for next time stories of Buffalo Bill, where you can sit back, grab your cup of tea, coffee, or whatever favorite beverage you have, and rest, relax, and listen to a good story from 100 years ago or better. Oh, over 100 years ago. Taking you back into the Wild West with Buffalo Bill. So remember, everybody, go out and make it a great day. Put a smile on somebody's face. Wave to them a little bit. Smile at them. Something. Wave to your neighbor. Don't make enemies. Remember, peace, love, all that good stuff is just right around the corner. So with that, remember, be the frequency you want to receive. I love you all, everyone. Peace, everyone.